Thank you, Tom. Dear Tim, for those in the audience that do not know PACE research, can you tell me a little bit more, or tell us a little bit more, what kind of studies your company does?
Yeah, sure. So the main areas we focus on are on industry and market dynamics, and that's really looking at the changing patterns of demand and future industry and market norms, which obviously at this stage of the industry's evolution is particularly important. The second area we look at is digital and functional maturity, and we assess companies to help them figure out where and how to invest in order to improve their performance. And obviously, in a climate of rising digital maturity, the challenges of businesses not only selling online but also helping customers, use and consume services is also a challenge. And then the last area is we do research into the technology sectors that support the hotel and travel industry, and looking at which ones will be the most important technologies for helping companies evolve in the future, and what is it about them and which areas should they invest in or not. So those three areas we think provide quite an important set of insights to help companies in their general strategy decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in the current crisis, Tim, what kind of insights do travel and hospitality businesses need to start preparing for a recovery?
Well, I think contextually, when you look at some of the big picture changes that have happened to the industry, one of the most important and one of the most obvious is demand is considerably lower now than it has been in the last 12 years. And with lower occupancies, what that means is that whilst industry still will hold RevPAR as a very important measure, will still look to yield prices where they can, in a lower state of occupancy, it's very important that businesses are looking at how much revenue they can make per guest or per customer or per passenger in their services. So that means that companies are looking now more at what they sell, whether they can sell more things to their guest customers or passengers, and how they do that to boost revenue productivity. And I think for the next 3 or 4 years, that is going to be a very, very important thing. And the other big thing that I would say is really occupying the minds of most companies in travel and hospitality is how they can lift their customer experience, not only in shopping, but also in consumption and utilization of their services, because that is increasingly becoming an important aspect of how companies compete. In fact, if you look at companies like Uber as an example, they are really doing nothing to change the cab business. What they're doing is enabling people to hail cabs with confidence and get what they need easily. Now, that is customer experience, and they built a $19 billion business on the back of it. So if one thinks about those aspects and how those will continue to be more important, we think those are areas that are going to shape the hotel industry in the future.
So what about some future business criteria then?
Well, I think if one looks at the long term and says, what is likely to be different about the future in terms of the way people invest, I would say there are two things that rise to the surface for me. One is sustainability, not just in terms of how we treat the planet, but all forms of sustainability, and making sustainable choices more affordable for the mass consumer to be able to make. So I think you're already seeing examples of distribution companies who are collecting together, in quotes, sustainable hotels in order to sell, that trend will only evolve. And of course, a trend that has been already rising over the last decade and will continue to do so is rising digital maturity. And that, put simply, is companies transforming their business to operate and compete in a digital world. And I think those two areas are going to shape a lot of the investments that hotel companies make in the future.
Great, thanks, Tim. Very interesting insights there. And I can also imagine that the road to recovery depends on how the market develops, especially in the light of the current pandemic. And with that, I turn to Jeroen, because you published a first scenario outlook when the COVID-19 crisis first began. And currently, we know that you're working with PACE on much more elaborate scenarios. So just wondering, what value do such scenarios bring to the industry?
Yeah, thank you. So if we think about scenario planning, what we do basically is, if people think about the future, they base their view of the future on a series of assumptions. And when we do scenario planning, we basically challenge those assumptions. So that means that we can visualize the outer boundaries of what could possibly happen. And the scenarios that come out of that sometimes may sound really extreme, but they help professionals and businesses anticipate the potential outcomes within those extreme boundaries. So it's really about drawing a map of the future and indicating the signposts that people have to look out for changes and to anticipate potential consequences and for them to make strategic choices.
So if we hone in on where we are today, a year into the crisis, looking back, how has your view of this crisis evolved?
Yeah. Well, we from the beginning onwards have been very cautious. So I think back 1 year, then you had some agencies, some companies making scenarios for the future, and they were quite optimistic and speaking about a V-shaped scenario. And we thought that was unlikely to happen. So we thought that maybe if you held interviews at that moment, that those views about the future, that V-shape was based more on hope than on analysis. So the assumption was at that moment that this crisis would be very similar to the SARS crisis 2 decades ago, and that as a consequence we would see an immediate and full recovery. And after that first moment, we saw also that there was a tendency to underestimate recovery potential and to overestimate the stability of the situation. So looking back now 1 year, we have had glimpses of hope at several moments. So I remember last summer we thought, well, maybe this is over. We thought last November, so vaccination starts. But the scenarios that we have been developing really foresaw those weaknesses, and they foresaw that the assumptions that we had in those moments of hope, that they drove an optimism that has not become true.
So how do you look at, are we in a moment of hope now in the Netherlands, 28th of April, restaurants finally open, or the terrace? No, but what is the likely scenario that you see at this moment?
Yeah, we always have hope, but hope is not a strategy. So I think if I would have to define the most plausible outcomes at this moment, the most optimistic scenario is a real slow recovery. If you look at the overall economy, so I do expect leisure travel to bounce back quite fast, but the overall economy will recover quite slowly in the best case scenario, meaning that will take several years. But there's also imaginable an in-between situation with permanent ups and downs, and people just have to think of the situation we were in last summer when we could do certain things, but not all of the things. So the bumps on the road ahead are dependent on how the markets will react, and especially also how governments will intervene.
Yeah, great. So Tim, we've heard that Jeroen's view of the crisis has indeed evolved, and 1 year into the crisis, we do see different impacts on different segments in the hospitality industry, and this was also brought up by the panels in the previous session. How do you expect recovery to happen in a more generalized way, or will some segments bounce back with more ease than others?
Well, I certainly think the most obvious area of recovery first will be in leisure demand. And we saw that last summer characterize itself because there was, on one side, significant investment by governments through furlough schemes. At the same side, people have an innate desire to travel for leisure. So that was very positive. But I think the big difference in the way that leisure demand will recover will reverse and turn on their head many of the trends that we saw before the COVID crisis. So, for example, before the COVID crisis, international travel was rising quicker than domestic. That is clearly reversed. Cities were growing faster in terms of demand than regions. Again, that's been reversed. And there's a great propensity for people to stay in short-term rental accommodation. So that will become a logical choice, a greater logical choice, in addition to hotels. And ground transport over air is also a trend which has been reversed. So I think leisure will bounce back fastest. Obviously, that is dependent on government restrictions, but the shape and nature of leisure travel will be quite different. And that will sustain for quite some time as the markets come back.
Yeah, I find that very interesting. But it also triggers the questions of what about other segments like business travel?
Well, sure, and I think one should look at business in a couple of sub-segments, if I can use that phrase. Unmanaged travel is more likely to recover fastest, meaning individuals trying to meet clients, partners, and suppliers. There is still a huge need for that to happen, and business owners, people who are running their own small businesses, that is likely to be a strong area of demand. When you think about corporate travel, particularly large corporate travel, a large proportion of the meetings that team members are having are internal. And in that regard, they have already found, for some meeting types and training, alternative ways of being able to satisfy those needs. For example, review meetings via video conferencing, etc. Actually, for some leaders, have commented to me, makes them more accessible because they spend less time traveling and they are able to be more accessible to their team members by linking via video conference. I think that sends a signal that the shape and nature of corporate travel will change. The need to meet customers will still be there, but I think the big change will be on internal meetings that will likely change and reduce. On groups and events, they will probably take the longest to recover for the obvious reasons that government restrictions and health is a really key factor. And secondly, individual employees and consumers will also be very much more conscious about health concerns in both travel and attendance to group of meetings. And I think the last thing to not forget on all of this is the geographic patterns on which business, whether it's unmanaged or managed leisure and groups and events, the geographic differences on how these will recover will also be very significant. And that is not to do with the COVID crisis, or in part it is, but it's mostly to do with underlying factors like industrial maturity, like GDP for the business, like balance of trade. So those factors shape the nature of how countries recover. And then on top of that, you have government intervention and government policy that also has a significant factor. So when one thinks about, translates this and says, well, how might this materialize? Well, think about, in Europe, for example, UK, Netherlands, and Germany. They likely will see a stronger rebound in leisure, not from international visitors, but simply because their own domestic population can't travel internationally, and they have sufficient demand to actually increase overall domestic demand for leisure in their countries than they would lose from international travel. If you reflect on the difference between that and many Mediterranean countries are very dependent on international visitors, and they will suffer more. So by looking at some of these examples, it's not as simple as to say travel or even leisure, business and groups and meetings. One needs to look at the country differences to see what the impact will be by country as well as by line of business or purpose of travel. And so I think that the understanding this is going to be very important for companies when it comes to investment decisions and balancing where their resources are.
Yeah, so, I'm thinking, Jeroen, keeping in mind what Tim just said, that especially, Southern Europe or Mediterranean countries struggle to fill that gap of international travels, and seeing that the pandemic was an unexpected event, they cannot really be blamed for that, right? For not having the right strategies in place to replace that demand. So I'm wondering, you are working on scenario planning. Is it at all possible to strategically anticipate this kind of developments?
Yes, good question. So in scenario planning, we speak of wildcards or of black swans in these cases of an exogenous, very unexpected event with an enormous impact. But ironically, a pandemic pertains to that category of wildcards, but a pandemic was not unforeseen. So most countries had pandemic plans prepared, and many businesses as well had prepared for a pandemic. The only wrong assumption was that most people expected an influenza pandemic to emerge if there would be a pandemic. And an influenza pandemic has a completely different behavior and a completely different spreading pattern. So while we had these plans in place, things evolved differently, and thus we did not react according to the plans that were prepared, neither in the Netherlands nor in Southern Europe, nowhere around the world. So if you look at the function of scenario planning, it is to make these contingency plans, to explore the assumptions that we make when we make those strategic plans, and to help people anticipate different events, and to help people think creatively about what they might do if things go wrong, and thus help businesses and also professionals to make smarter investment decisions.
Yeah, great. So just turning back to you, Tim, thinking about that, what Jeroen was, saying with scenario planning and market insights can obviously help hospitality companies bouncing back. But then, the question also comes to how government responses, how might they influence the way business can respond in this crisis?
Yeah, well, I think that there are multiple ways in which governments are influencing company choices. I mean, starting with the most obvious, the government policies and restrictions don't influence, they control businesses insofar as they order some businesses to close and determine when those businesses are able to open. And obviously the health standards under which they are able to open. So those are less about influence and more about control. A secondary level, though, is the way in which governments and different governments are providing loans, grants, and schemes like furlough schemes that enable businesses to survive despite closure and reorganize in order to recover as demand returns. So that really does affect particularly small businesses and the owners of hotels very significantly, because those companies still have many of the costs of operation, even so they are closed. Longer term, though, I think that the coordination between governments is going to become very significant. Whilst now I would describe government action as somewhat unilateral and national focused, the ability for governments to interact on things like vaccination programs and safety standards and other factors of this nature will hopefully reduce the risk of future pandemics happening, or when they do happening, the impacts of those pandemics on the disruption to industry. And I think that even beyond that, when you look longer term to my earlier comments about future trends, governments are playing a huge role when it comes to two things. One is, if you think about the explosion in online demand that we've seen over the last 18 months as a result of the COVID crisis, that is not a new trend. It's just an acceleration of an existing trend. But what that has done is created very large digital giants that are distorting economies by suppressing wages in some countries and recovering taxes to other countries. So that is a governmental issue that goes beyond the travel and hospitality industry. But the impact is causing them to increase the level of regulation through things like consumer protection, privacy, anti-competitive behavior, equality. Those areas are areas where we will see rising regulation in order to level the competitive field between these economic distortions that are currently taking place. And the other area where this is also true is in sustainability. If we think about what drives sustainability, society in some way drives governments. Governments in many ways also drive and set standards, set goals, and that colors investment. And investment then enables investment, and regulation then starts to influence businesses. Well, what you're seeing now is two broad themes: rising regulation to help level the competitive playing field, and a much increased focus on sustainability, which is driving both penalties for and standards against which companies will have to comply, but also access to debt and access to investment as investors become more conscious and set more criteria around sustainability for growth. And I think that's where governments are going to affect the long-term shape of how the hotel industry evolves.
Yeah, great, thanks. Just very quickly, Jeroen, before we have to round off, looking forward, I suppose both long and short term, what are the main factors that we need to monitor, you believe, to understand what we're going? Just maybe if you can wrap it up for us, and then we'll go to some questions.
Yes, exactly. Those are the signposts on the road that we have to look at. In the first place, there's the effectiveness of health responses. So if you think about vaccines, so we said in the beginning already in our scenario plan, so this is not a black and white picture that either there is a vaccine or there's not. There are many stages in between, and this is what we see playing out currently. So ineffective strategies and emergent virus variants have all created curves ahead on the road. The second big variable is policy responses. So at this moment, every single country is extremely cautious. But I think for the economy in the future, the main issues are transparency and predictability of those policy responses. And finally, and this is currently, I'm afraid, a little bit underestimated, that is consumer confidence. So how will markets react if this goes on for a few more months or for another year? And some economists have suggested there will be a deflationary scenario, and others speak of return of inflation. So those situations would have an enormous and dramatic impact on an indebted world that tries to recover.
Great, thanks, Jeroen. I think it wraps it up. So we have to look out for effectiveness of health responses, policy responses, and consumer confidence. Yeah, great. So with that, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me on stage this morning. I'm very sorry we didn't manage to get Tim up here. We have practiced this many times and then it worked, but then you see, this happens sometimes. We're now ready to answer some questions. I heard from our host, Tom, that there are quite a few in the chat. So fire away, Tom, if you want.
Yeah, There was a very enthusiastic discussion going on, but for the sake of time, indeed, we may need to stick to a few, but I do want to thank everyone who was posting questions. One question from Stephen Smith was, government intervention and private consumption will be the strongest drivers behind recovery. Have there been best practices in countries with regards to government intervention that work best and that could be applied globally?
Well, would you like me to answer that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So arguably, it's tough to say, are there best practices that could be replicated in other countries and executed to the same effect? There, I think that is an unproven and difficult to answer question. However, there are certainly differences that one can observe and differences in terms of outcome that's been experienced. And one contrasts markets like Australia and New Zealand that controlled strongly in the early stages and drove down the COVID proliferation to a very low level such that their test, track and trace could work. And they have managed to open up their economy and sustain that for some time. If you look at China, again, initially a lot of success, but actually China now are suffering a little bit of a resurgence in the COVID crisis, and that is impacting travel and occupancies in their country. And of course, then when you compare that to Europe, it's really been a very mixed bag and a very mixed bag of fortunes. So I'm sure there are some best practices that could be taken out, but I think it's difficult to be too simplistic and simply say, because it worked in one country, it will work in another. Because I think there are other factors like density of population and geographic landmass and other things of that nature, which may make it difficult to simply say, ah, yes, you can replicate one and apply it to another.
Well, yeah, I want to say thank you for sharing that, Tim. And I must say, like, we have an image of you on screen, but it's not the same with the facial expression. I mean, you are smiling in this picture, so you are positive, but unfortunately, I think we sent you a few different links, but maybe down the line you can get it working. For now, because we are running a little bit out of time for this session, and I'm afraid that we're going to move out into the breakout rooms to give people the opportunity to discuss it for themselves. But for all the questions that people would still like to ask, I can inform you that there is, at the end of the day, there is an opportunity to have a more private conversation and to have drinks and do networking with, including Tim, but with a number of the panelists as well to further explore these topics. The question, I think I want to thank you very much, Anna de Visser, for hosting it and also for posing this question, is what are the best practices for a speedy recovery? And that's the question that we would like to invite you to discuss in the breakout rooms. So here comes the second digital challenge of today. You've already done an excellent job the first time, but now we're going to do the exact same exercise where I'm going to first invite someone to post the link to the navigator. Let's see, Menno or someone who is there. Otherwise, I have it here as well. A link to the navigator and open the navigator in the browser. And then in a few minutes, I will invite all of you back to my fellow co-host in the other room to discuss these insights for yourself. And of course, I can't wait to hear which ideas and which insights come from those discussions. The session will be approximately till 12:05. That's when the breakout sessions will end. There will be a lunch break right after that. For that lunch break, you are also welcome in the plenary session here. So you can come back to the session here. If you click on the lunch, it will take you back here. And then at 12:20, we'll do a little mindfulness. And of course, we'll open our little lunch communication corner here where you can chat, where we'll invite some of the participants about their experiences.